Welcome to Infectious Conversations, the Infectious Diseases podcast recorded at WVU Medicine in Morgantown, West Virginia. And now your host, Dr. Meera Mehta.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Infectious Conversations. This is WVU Medicine's Infectious Diseases podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Meera Mehta. I'm a clinical infectious diseases specialist. And today we have a great guest with us, Dr. Megan Hardy. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Meera. Thanks so much for having me. Like Meera said, I am Megan Hardy. I am one of the infectious diseases pharmacy specialists at WVU Medicine.
Yeah, Megan, this is your second time on this show. You previously did an episode on Candida auris, so thanks for coming back.
Absolutely. Happy to be back.
Yeah, thanks. So today we're going to be talking about the bubonic plague. Now, in the 14th century, the bubonic plague actually caused a pandemic, also known as the Black Death, and this caused 50 million deaths, and it almost wiped out a quarter of Europe's population. And then later, those outbreaks spread to India and China as well. Today, it's actually endemic to parts of Africa, South America, Central Asia, and also parts of the Western US. But the reason why I'm bringing this up today is if you've been following the headlines, there has been a recent case of the bubonic plague in Colorado. So about 100 miles south of Denver, there has been a confirmed infection. And actually, earlier this year, there have been two other cases as well. So one was in New Mexico, and then there was a case in Oregon too. Now, it's really not that common today in the US. Actually, the CDC says on average there's about 7 cases in the US per year, so not super common, but I still think it's something that we should be aware of and talk about, especially since it's been in the headlines recently. So Megan, if you want to start us off and talk about what organism causes the bubonic plague and how is it spread?
Absolutely. So the bubonic plague is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, and it can affect humans, but more commonly other mammals. So it's actually transmitted via fleas being the vector for the disease, and rodents or other mammals being the host. So it can be transmitted mostly by fleas infecting rodents, and those rodents subsequently pass them along to humans, which once again, relatively uncommon. So more often than not, it just will affect the rodents. And that's as far as, like Meera said, outbreaks or cases earlier this year being out west in the United States. So if they are in the United States, more commonly in rural areas or semi-rural areas out west that have rodents, as far as like prairie dogs, rabbits, squirrels, rats are pretty common. And that's where we probably most commonly think of the plague being spread is through rats. Also in areas of urban areas where there's a large concentration of like rats that can cause or that can be more cause for just concern of plague spreading. But once again, not common to affect humans, at least not anymore.
Yeah, typically humans, as Megan said, would get infected by a bite, or if a human was handling the dead body of an animal that had an infection, can also be passed on that way as well. Now, dogs and cats can also get it, right, Megan?
Yes. But
it's not really typical for it to be in dogs and cats, but it can be spread to dogs and cats by the fleas. So in terms of the symptoms that can be caused, so really there are 3 main types of bubonic plague, or 3 main forms of this disease. The first form is called bubonic or bubonic plague, and essentially the incubation for this version, it takes about 2 to 8 days to happen. It has a mortality rate of about 66% if there is no treatment. So that's a pretty high mortality rate. But if you're able to treat a patient, that rate goes down to 13%. Now, the signs of symptoms of having the bubonic plague, typically it's going to be fevers, chills, headaches, a general feeling of malaise and not feeling well. But one of the characteristic signs of the bubonic plague is that you will have what we call buboes. So that is where your lymph nodes will swell up and they'll become very, very painful and tender. Now, typically, this is going to show up in the groin area the most. And fun fact, the word bubon means groin. And so that's where the name bubonic came from. But it can also affect your axillary or your lymph nodes in the armpits and then in the neck as well. So typically, this is a disease, it's going to spread to your macrophages in your immune system first, and then it will go on to spread throughout your lymph nodes. So 90% of cases, they present as this bubonic form. The second form is a bit less common. About 10% of cases present as this form, but it's called a septicemic form. And this is when you have progression of the disease, and now you have endotoxins as well. So the fatality rate is very, very high. If you have septicemic version, the fatality rate is 90% if it's untreated, 40% if it's treated. So that's still a very high rate if it is treated. And in this form, essentially, it's affecting your whole body now. So your patient is septic and hypotensive. And with this form, you can actually get hemorrhaging under the skin. And when that happens, the skin turns black. And that's why this was called the Black Plague, is because parts of the skin would turn black, and also extremities like fingers and toes could turn black as well. And so that's where the name Black Plague came from. The third form is the pneumonic form, and this is the only form that can be transmitted from person to person. So typically the bubonic form isn't transmitted between people. Usually it requires a flea or a vector to pass it on. But the pneumonic form, you can actually have transmission through direct inhalation of respiratory droplets, or you could be infected with the bubonic form and then it will spread to your lungs. And then this version is 100% mortality rate if it goes untreated. So it's very, very high. But if you treat it, it's about a 30% mortality rate. So typically, these are the signs and symptoms and the forms of the bubonic plague. Megan, let's chat about prevention strategies from getting this.
Absolutely. So one of the biggest ways that we can prevent this from even happening is by taking preventative actions. And like Mira said, though it's not common to be transmitted via like household pets, it is still possible. And for that reason, it's really important to flea treat your pets and keep them on preventative flea medications, especially if they are free roaming outside. So if you let your dogs or cats run around outside, and if they have any contact with fleas or infected rodents, it helps really mitigate some of that. So flea treatment, and then just keeping an eye on, your rodent population around your house whenever possible. So that being, containing any food or garbage so that rodents can't get into it, and keeping them away from your house and making it uncomfortable or uninhabitable for them. As well as any free roaming pets that you may have at home, preferably not letting them sleep in your bed with you. I know a lot of people do like to do that, and so that might be a tough one. But once again, the flea treatment is a big part of that. And as far as for humans, using insect repellents when you go into wooded areas.
Idea.
So preventing that direct transmission from fleas. Once again, it's not as common for the fleas to directly affect the humans, but you still can get flea bites. So just preventing that contact altogether is very helpful.
All right. Thanks, Megan, for those great prevention tips. So before we talk about the treatment and how we treat it today, I just wanted to go over some of the medieval treatment options that they tried. Now, back in those days, they did not have any antibiotics, so they had to get pretty creative. So one of the options they used was actually cutting and draining the enlarged lymph nodes. They also used leeches to try and suck out what they considered bad blood from the patient. Oh. Emeralds were actually used to treat the bubonic plague. So certain people who could afford emeralds, they will actually crush them up with a mortar and a pestle. But for people who couldn't afford emeralds, they would actually ingest mercury and arsenic.
Oh,
and
goodness.
so that was actually deadlier than having the bubonic plague itself. Using incense was also used, so trying to just fumigate the air. And then there was another method of putting cups on your skin. And the thought behind that was basically making the disease go into the cup and moving out of the body and into the cup to collect it. Now, one method that they did use that was helpful was quarantining. So actually having people not be in close contact, of course, that would help prevent that respiratory pulmonic phase of the infection. Ground unicorn horn was another thing. And I don't know where one would find a unicorn, but that's something that's documented that was used.
Maybe they were narwhal horns.
Yeah, it could have been. And then Four Thieves vinegar, which was a mixture of cider, vinegar, wine, and then spices like sage and rosemary, which actually sounds nice. I could have a Four Thieves vinegar right
Absolutely.
now.
That sounds pleasant, yeah.
Yep, so those were all the treatments that didn't work, minus the quarantine, which actually did help. But Megan, what do we use today?
Well, luckily, we do have antibiotics now, and plague can actually be successfully treated with those antibiotics, and they're pretty common antibiotics that we use for a lot of different infectious indications. So it's really crazy to think that we used such really kind of outlandish methods back in the medieval times, and just how far, I mean, granted, that was, of course, hundreds of years ago, but just how far things have come. So even though we do have antibiotics to treat this, like Mira said, as far as preventing it from getting to that pneumonic phase of the bubonic plague, quick treatment is very important. So, we have a lot higher treatment success rate when we treat it earlier on, and if we don't let the disease progress. And the antibiotics that we can use for that are, like I said, common ones. So fluoroquinolones, so levofloxacin, ciprofloxacin, moxifloxacin, as well as gentamicin, and also doxycycline. So all three of those classes of antibiotics can be used in treatment duration typically being 10 to 14 days. So not even a super long treatment duration for these. So it's really remarkable how far these treatments have come and what we've learned about it over the years.
Yeah, it really is. And I was reading that aminoglycosides are preferred, and that's just because most of the data comes from aminoglycosides. But some of these other options like fluoroquinolones, doxycycline, we use these every day for other infections as well. So there are antibiotics that are actually quite common. So there's no way to really eradicate the bubonic plague. It's quite hard to eradicate it completely. Some people might ask, well, why is it still around if it only has about 7 cases per year? And that again goes back to it really lives in these animals and rodents, and so it's really going to be hard to eradicate it from them. But overall, I think it's still good information to know, and we probably won't see cases in this area just because it is the Western United States where most of these cases do happen when they do, but a lot of people travel out there, so I think it's important to know this information. Megan, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I think just the key here is, even though it's not something for us to be really concerned about right now, that prevention is key.
Yeah.
And I just think that that's important just in general, to prevent any sort of infestations with, honestly, any pests. So aside from the infection standpoint, just keeping those things at bay and protecting your pets, protecting your family, and protecting yourself. So
awesome. Great advice. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate everyone listening to this episode of Infectious Conversations. I was your host, Dr. Mira Mehta. Our guest today was Dr. Megan Hardy, and we hope you tune in to our next episode. Thank you.